Chapter 13. Northern California. Almost into Oregon, on the east side of Goose Lake, nestled beneath the spreading green canopy of old-growth pines, was a small log cabin. It had one story, a stone chimney, and 3 rooms, one with a glass wall facing the lake, as well as a state-of-the-art wood stove. It also boasted its own generator, plus a slew of more esoteric gadgets. For a rustic log cabin, it was amazingly 21st century. Extending out into the lake nearby was a wooden pier. A small boat with an outboard motor was tied up at the far end. The pier was so low to the water that one could step aboard easily. At the very end of the pier, seated in an aluminium chair with yellow plastic webbing, was a big man of about 60. His grey hair was covered with a battered khaki hat decorated with fishhooks and a plastic badge that held a fishing and a hunting license. He wore tan shorts, white socks with sandals, and a neon orange shirt decorated with bright blue hibiscus blossoms and green hummingbirds. In one hand, he held a high-end rod and a reel, the butt end resting on his thigh. The other hand was curled in his lap. He appeared to be dozing. Beside him, a can of beer sat atop a red and white cooler. Dieter had been observing this tranquil scene for over 2 hours from various locations around the cabin. It appeared that there wasn't anybody around except for him and the old man, which made a nice change. Several times now, he'd had to abort contact with somebody he wanted to recruit because of a sector presence. But if they were here, they were too well hidden for him to spot. Time to make his move. He crept silently towards the pier. The old man's hand jerked, and suddenly he held a Walther P-38, old and well-maintained, and deadly. The 9mm eye-hole looking as big as a cannon when it settled unwaveringly on Dieter's face. His eyes moved to the tiny mirrors on the inner edge of his oversized sunglasses. "Jesus Christ, Dieter! What took you so damned long?" he demanded. "I thought my goddamn bladder was going to explode." He stood up and held out the rod. "Here, reel this in and come into the cabin." Dieter stood with his mouth open, caught flat-footed. Like some raw recruit, he thought. "How did you know?" he asked, accepting the rod. "Christ almighty, you were making so much racket I thought I was being invaded by bears. Bring the beer in too." Von Rossbach watched the older man trot up the path to the cabin for a moment. Then, shaking his head, he began to reel in the unused lure. He'd always said the boss was psychic. When Von Rossbach was a young agent assigned to Doc Holmes's unit, he'd quickly become aware that his mentor possessed an acute situational awareness. And though Doc was well schooled in every facet of covert technology, he made it plain that he preferred his agents to rely mainly on their native faculties. "What are you gonna do if your batteries run out?" he'd ask sarcastically. "Go home?" Doc could be as exasperating as he was amazing. At some point, whenever they got together, he left Dieter feeling like the overconfident young student in a kung fu movie who could never get the best of the master. Dieter tucked the rod under one arm, the chair under the other, and picked up the cooler. In a way, it was kind of nice to know that he still had things to learn. At least it means that I am not the old master yet. And he's never made me walk over rice paper without tearing it, or asked me to trust the Force. When he entered the cabin, Doc was flicking switches on what looked like an incredibly complex stereo unit. "Sit down," Doc invited. "Have yourself a brew." He continued to fiddle with the console, though no music began to play. Von Rossbach selected a beer and sat watching him, making no comment. Finally, Holmes took a seat himself, and indicating the console, spoke as though continuing an ongoing conversation. "Yeah, the sector promised me they wouldn't keep me under observation when I retired. They lied." He put a finger by his nose and winked. "But I never made them any promises in return. What I just did then was erase that little bit of conversation we just had and replaced it with tweeting birds and lake water lapping the pier." He grinned. "I pity the poor schmo they've got listening in on me. His brain is probably turning to New Age paste." Taking a sip of beer, he studied his former agent. "So, what brings you here to Goose Lake? I heard you'd retired to Paraguay, of all places." Dieter shifted in his chair. "Paraguay is nice," he said, a bit defensively. "A little boring sometimes, but basically very nice." With a snort, Doc said, "So's Goose Lake, if you like being bored out of your mind." He wagged a finger. "You've been causing comment, dear boy. What's this I hear about you and Sarah Connor?" "How do you know about that?" Von Rossbach demanded. Doc looked smug. "Remember how I said I never made them any promises? Well, I found a way to keep myself updated. When you left, I hear you just left." "I burned out all at once," Dieter agreed. "I couldn't wait to get out of there." They agreed. "Wanna talk about it?" Doc asked. "Nothing to talk about," Von Rossbach said. "There was nothing particular about my last mission that made it my last. It just was. Maybe I didn't take enough time between assignments. Maybe I should have taken a desk job instead of staying in the field." He shrugged his big shoulders. "I don't know. It was just over." Holmes looked at him shrewdly. "I ask again, what's this about Sarah Connor? Not like you to side with terrorists." Is that what they're saying? Dieter thought. Of course it was. What else could they think? "Sarah Connor isn't a terrorist," he said aloud. His voice was flat when he said it. He didn't expect to be believed. Doc raised a brow at that. "She's not. She's bombed at least 3 computer companies that we know of. Okay, 2 of them were Cyberdyne, but that still counts as 3 hits. Not to mention she's guilty of drug smuggling and arms dealing. These are things that terrorists do, buddy. Dieter sighed. He was about to risk something he really valued here. The continued respect of this man. But what if she's not crazy, Doc? He looked up and met the other man's eyes. Both of Doc's brows went up at that. He sat contemplating his former agent for a while. Not crazy, he said at last. Would you be willing to listen? Von Rossbach asked him. Holmes pursed his lips and blew out a stream of air. He shrugged. Sure, what the hell? I haven't got anything else on my schedule right now. Dieter studied him carefully. If he didn't buy this story, Dieter knew Doc would turn him into the sector in a New York minute. He ran one hand over his face, feeling desperate. Well, this is what you're here for, he told himself. It's all true, he said simply. Dieter waved his hands. All of it. For a moment, Doc sat still, looking expectant. That's it? He exclaimed. That's your explanation? 'Cause I'm sitting here waiting for something more. What if all I know about Sarah Connor is that she likes to blow up computer companies? Tossing his head impatiently, von Rossbach said, You know more about the case than that. I know you better. I worked for you for 10 years. If you saw my name connected with hers in the sector's files, you'd look into it. I know you would. Doc waggled his head back and forth. Okay, good call. He went silent for a while, his eyes on the middle distance. I have to admit I was very intrigued by that guy who shot up the police station, then showed up 10 years later in a shopping mall. He waved a hand at von Rossbach. It was you, except that at the time of both incidents, you were working for me, and in the first case, you were actually physically with me. So what am I supposed to think? I know you don't have an evil identical twin. I know they say everybody has a double, but that's bullshit. Dieter watched Doc as he worked it through, the older man's fingers tapping on the arms of his chair. Doc looked up at him. Connor says that this guy was some kind of a robot. A statement that was really a question. Dieter nodded. I got to meet a couple of them, Doc. They looked exactly like me. I saw their insides. They're made of metal. Rods and cams, hydraulics, a really impressive small power unit, computer controls, neural net computers. They're real. After studying Dieter for a moment, Doc said, So it follows that the ultimate killer computer and this Judgment Day crap, all that's real too. I hope not. That's what Sarah has been trying to prevent all these years. He bit his lip. Unfortunately, we've come to the conclusion that maybe it can't be stopped. Maybe it's meant to happen, and there's nothing that can be done to prevent it. The best that we can do is mitigate the circumstances, which is why I'm here. Yeah, Wang said you were recruiting people. Doc waited him out. Dieter could feel heat creeping up his face. Only Doc could make him feel like a naive kid saying something stupid. So, I was hoping that we could rely on you to help when the time came. There, that was it. This time, he waited for Holmes to speak. You're serious about this. I can see that, Doc said at last. I'm not gonna tell you it makes me feel good. Like you found a nice hobby to enliven your retirement. He tightened his lips to a thin line, then met von Rossbach's eyes. But I've trusted you before now and been right. So, I'll take a chance and agree to help you, but... He held up a stern finger. I'm not going to be party to any wacko terrorist behavior. If your girlfriend feels an urge to blow up anything else, I'd advise you to talk her out of it. Or I'm gone. Got it? Yes, Dieter said simply. Thank you. So, what do you want from me anyway? When the time comes, we'll need someplace marginally safe for people to go to. Dieter looked out at the peaceful lake. This would make a good destination. We'll also need your training skills. He hesitated. And we'll need some place to stockpile supplies. Von Rossbach was enormously relieved. The fact that Holmes had agreed so readily meant that he'd given the matter study and thought. And where Doc led, others would follow. Generations of sector agents and allies had worked with or trained under the old man. He was glad he'd taken the chance and approached him. Doc nodded once or twice, then narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. How bad do you expect this thing to get? Bad, Dieter said. Not as bad as it would have been 6 years ago maybe, but bad. Billions dead. End of civilization as we know it. Possible extinction of the human race. Holmes nodded, his eyes on the braided rug beneath his feet. Then he looked up, his eyes sharp. I really hope she's crazy, Dieter, if that's an improvement on the original version. One corner of the Austrian's mouth quirked in a half smile. I wish she was. On the highway to Utah. If anyone had been able to see through the van's darkened windows, they would have seen a pair of tall, grim-faced twins, a short, dark, balding muscle man, and a child of angelic beauty. Alyssa's golden hair curled to the center of her back, and she looked adorable in a little blue sundress and white sandals. She carried an adult's white purse that was almost as big as she was. The purse contained all of their identity papers, driver's licenses for each of the Terminators, the deed on their new house, the van's registration, and several $1,000s in cash. All that Clea thought they would need to get them safely to their new location in Utah. The older Infiltrator didn't know that Alyssa had gathered all of this material in one place, and would have disapproved if she had known. But to Alyssa it felt right, and since she didn't really trust her older sibling, she went with her feelings. Alyssa was looking forward to getting settled in. She was long overdue for her next growth enhancement, and the sense of being off schedule tormented her. Once in a while, to distract herself, she checked her sister's computer to view whatever Clea was looking at. She wasn't interested in communication so much as she wished she was in a more interesting place than the endless expanse of rolling sagebrush outside. New York was enormous, filled with buildings of staggering size and teeming with life. At once fascinating and revolting. For the most part, like the Terminators, she ignored the often spectacular scenery that they were traveling through. Occasionally, she would take note of a suitable spot for an ambush, or places for the automated factories. But for the most part, this land was empty, and, as far as she could see, always would be. She flicked her inner vision back to the busy New York streets. That was where the war would take place. There, along the Mississippi and on the West Coast. Soon, she hoped. For now, this empty land was a good place to begin laying plans and manufacturing allies. "I'm hungry," she said eventually. "Pull in to the next available place." The Terminators didn't acknowledge her order. There was no need. Even voicing it aloud was mainly a matter of training herself in humanizing her mannerisms. They did have supplies in the van, but she was bored and wished to begin socializing both herself and the Terminators, to the degree that any of them was capable. You really couldn't terminate humans effectively if they had warning. Duffy's Diner, Utah. The restaurant was clean, with a black and white tile floor and chipped formica surfaces. It smelled of cooking, but of no particular food or spice, unless it was hot oil. The four of them took a booth where rips in the plastic cover had been carefully patched with duct tape, and a waitress in a pink uniform and comfortable-looking shoes came over with a plastic-coated menu. The menus were slightly sticky to the touch. "Blue plate specials chicken fried steak," she announced to the puzzled machines and Infiltrator. "Chicken fried steak?" Alyssa asked. She had a ridiculous mental image of a fowl flipping meat onto a grill. The waitress grinned. "You never had that, honey?" she asked. "You dip the steak in the same kind of coating you use for chicken. Then you fry it." "Interesting," the Infiltrator said. It didn't sound very healthy. "We'll have that," she said, handing the menu back to the woman. The waitress raised her brows and looked at the Terminators. In her experience, big, tough-looking men usually didn't take orders from little blonde moppets. You boys okay with that? She asked doubtfully. They handed back the menus and just looked at her. How would you like those steaks cooked? Alyssa blinked as she considered this. It felt like a trick question. Until they're done, she said after a moment. The waitress looked at her, a look that said, Don't give me any more nonsense, kid. Rare, medium, or well done? She asked tersely. Ah, medium, Alyssa said. That sounded like a safe choice. To drink? The waitress's voice hardened slightly under their unwavering gazes. Just water, Alyssa said. If the dinner was unhealthy, she need not compound the error with fluids made from a surfeit of sugar or caffeine. And you boys? The waitress stood with her pencil poised over her pad. For all of us, Alyssa told her. The waitress sniffed and shook her head as she moved off. Maybe they were playing some kind of road game to keep the kid entertained. Who cared? The girl seemed polite enough. Alyssa looked around the room with interest. All of the furnishings seemed to be at least 30 years old. Some of the advertisements included. At least those advertisements that took the form of clocks or lights did. Two men at the end of the counter were looking at her. They smiled at her and waggled their fingers in a friendly way. She just looked at them until they turned away. The waitress eventually returned with their food and placed a plate before each of the Terminators without comment, dropping the last one in front of Alyssa, who picked up her fork. What do you say? The woman asked, frowning and smiling at the same time. Alyssa and the Terminators looked at her mutely. The waitress glanced at the Terminators somewhat nervously. What's the magic word? She prompted the Infiltrator. This female has gone mad, the I-950 thought. She was certain that most humans didn't believe in magic. Had she done something to precipitate this condition? Thank you, the waitress said carefully. She glanced again at the Terminators, then back at Alyssa. You're welcome, the I-950 said, equally carefully. The waitress laughed. Enjoy, she said, and moved off, chuckling. Alyssa watched her go nervously. Insane humans were unpredictable, and, she'd read, often unnaturally strong. Such as a Terminator, she wondered. She'd have to look it up. Her excellent peripheral vision told her that two of the men at the counter were watching her. The I-950 frowned as she sawed at her meat. Was there something strange about her? She studied them carefully. They seemed ordinary enough. One was about 50, with glasses and greying hair. The other was younger, perhaps late 20s, early 30s. That one had dark hair and was thin. Their glances became more furtive, and the way they occasionally spoke to each other made her think they were talking about her. With a slight adjustment of her ears, she listened in. "So, what do you think?" the thin one asked. "Definitely potential." The older man glanced at her again. "Could be a real winner." "Well, should we go for it?" After a long pause, the older man said, "Big risk. Might not be worth the trouble." "Yeah, well, you gotta take the opportunities life sends you. We gotta do something, for Christ's sake." The thin man took a sip of his coffee. "We got bills to pay." The older man snorted and took a sip of his coffee. "Let's see if any opportunities present themselves, okay? No point in doing things the hard way if you don't have to. And those three boys look plenty hard, if you get my meaning." As far as Alyssa could tell, this conversation had nothing to do with her. In any case, it was irrelevant at the moment. She continued to eat steadily, her higher metabolism allowing her to eat adult volumes of food with ease. The waitress, when she returned, complimented her on it. "I was very hungry," Alyssa told her. "Are there facilities here?" The waitress pursed her lips in amusement and indicated a corridor to her right, moving aside when Alyssa slipped out of the booth. "She's cute," she said to the Terminators when Alyssa was out of hearing. They just looked at her. "So," she said crisply after a silent moment, "you gonna have dessert?" As one, the three Terminators looked towards the bathrooms. The waitress rolled her eyes. "Coffee then, until your little girl gets back." One of the men at the counter threw down some bills and left. The other headed for the restrooms. The waitress took note, estimating with a glance that the crumpled wad of money would pay their check. "Coffee," the senior Terminator said at last. The answer its decision tree had offered as the best response. The waitress nodded and cleared the table, and she made a bet with herself that these weirdos wouldn't tip. Clay Radcliffe was proud of the fact that, like the Boy Scouts on whom he had occasionally preyed, he was always prepared. He never left home without a nice clean handkerchief and his little bottle of chloroform tucked into his belt pouch. He lurked in the men's room, the door open just a fraction, watching for the glorious little moppet who was soon to be his little movie star. Alyssa finished her business, washed her hands, and disdained to use the endless linen towel that had apparently never been changed. Wiping off the wet on the skirt of her dress, she walked down the hall, back towards the Terminators. Clay swung out behind her and with practiced ease clapped the handkerchief over her small face, pulling her tight to his soft stomach as he dragged her into the men's room. Unexpectedly, the little brat clawed backward, obviously aiming for his groin. He barely got his leg up in time to protect himself, and even then she grabbed the muscle with the force of a metal clamp. Clay gasped in pain, his mouth wide open in agony and surprise. He swung her off her feet, and the girl began to pummel his legs with her sharp little heels. Each kick was like a hammer blow, and Clay spread his legs, trying to get away from the punishment. Desperately, he pressed her body against the wall, clamping her there with all his weight. Still, she wriggled and kicked. Damn, but the kid was strong. When the hell was she going to black out? Usually, they went down instantly. He was getting dizzy from the goddamned fumes, and she was still bucking like a bronco. Alyssa's computer enhancements worked hard to overcome the effects of the chloroform. They warned her that if she didn't break free in 10 seconds, she would succumb. The I-950 continued to fight. The slight differences in the muscle attachments in her arms and shoulders gave her a strength far beyond her size and years, and there was a greater flexibility built into her joints that allowed her to perform feats so unlikely that no ordinary human could anticipate them. She folded one leg behind her, pointing her foot, and rammed it upward into the man's groin. He gasped in agony, and his grip on her arms loosened. The I-950 twisted her arm free and reached up and back. The man didn't even have time to react to the touch of a tiny hand on his throat. One moment he was folding over the agony in his groin, still trying to keep hold of her. The next he was thrashing on the floor, clawing at thin air. Blood spraying from his throat, spurting from his mouth. He fell back, choking, his eyes bugging out in horror, the blood turning to a fan-shaped spray as he tried to scream. Alyssa's powerful little hand had snapped his windpipe like a paper straw. Out in the parking lot, Gil's fingers beat a nervous tattoo on the van's steering wheel. He'd been in position for over 5 minutes, and he was feeling very conspicuous. Nobody sits outside an emergency door in a van with the motor running for no reason. Anybody who noticed probably wouldn't think that reason was a good one. Most likely, they'd think he was waiting for someone to finish robbing the diner. He wished. Robbery carried a fairly light sentence compared with kidnapping. "Hurry your ass up, Clay," he thought fiercely. 3 minutes later, he slammed his palm against the wheel and opened the van door. He moved to the emergency door and opened it with exquisite caution. Gil breathed a sigh of relief when no alarm sounded. He peeked through the crack and saw no one in the short corridor. There was no sound from either bathroom. Gil looked around. No one was watching. So he slipped inside and moved quietly to the men's room. Pressing his ear against the door, he listened and heard water running. Carefully, he tried the knob and it turned. Gritting his teeth, Gil opened the door and slipped inside. The little girl washing her dress in the sink looked up at Gil, who stood frozen, staring at the man lying on the floor in a spreading pool of blood. Slowly, he turned to gaze at her sweet, expressionless face and innocent blue eyes, and wondered if he was having a nightmare. She blinked at him, and Gil shook his head. Her hair was drenched with blood, and her face and arms wore flecks of blood so tiny it looked as though they'd been applied in a fine spray. He took a deep breath of the fetid air in the tiny room and nearly gagged on the complex mixture of blood and feces and disinfectant. Gil knew that somehow this beautiful little girl was responsible. That somehow, like an avenging angel, she was the answer to all the prayers of all the kids that he and Clay had ever hurt. He pressed his back to the door, and all he could think to say to her was, "No," over and over, half plea, half denial. Alyssa stared at the human. Then she smiled slightly, watching him pale as her expression changed. "You should have knocked," she said gently. He turned to open the door, and she squatted to pick up the chloroform-soaked handkerchief, then sprang up and grabbed him, her legs clamping around his arms so tightly he couldn't dislodge her. The man shrugged and struggled, opening his mouth as though to shout. The I-950 pressed the handkerchief over his mouth and nose, effectively gagging him. Within seconds, he began to totter. Apparently, sensing his danger, he began trying to bite her, but Alyssa easily kept his jaws apart. Then he slammed himself into the bathroom door. She grimaced and held on, extending her senses to see if anyone had heard the sound. Apparently, the crash had been more significant in the bathroom's small confines. No one commented. No one came. Her computer tested the man's vital signs and concluded that he would shortly be unconscious. The I-950 lost patience. Shortly wasn't soon enough. She took one hand from his mouth and felt along the column of his throat. The man tried to shout, making muffled sounds, then tried to turn his head, obviously meaning to shake off both of her hands, almost succeeding in actually moving. Alyssa found what she was searching for, and with a flex of her fingers, she felt his hyoid bones snap. That should hurry things along, she thought with satisfaction. For a moment, his struggles became more violent. Then he fell forward. The computer confirmed unconsciousness, and she let him go. Pushing herself upright, she stared down at him. A brief spasm passed through the body, and it voided, finally going limp. That was good. She hadn't wanted any more blood to contend with. As she scrubbed her dress, the child part of Alyssa enjoyed pretending that Skynet had set up a test for her, just like it used to do for Serena, her mother's sister, a test that she had passed. But the computer part of her objected to the dissonance, and with a wistful sigh, she put the idea from her. She looked at the bodies on the floor. It would probably be best to leave here now. This incident had already caused enough delay. Holding up the dress, Alyssa studied it. Most of the stains were gone, but there was a shadow of brownish red at the neckline. Future washings would probably remove the stain. Meanwhile, she could hardly walk through the diner in a soaking wet dress. She ordered the T-101s to meet her at the van, and slipped out the back door in her underpants. MIT campus. The guys' attitude had changed dramatically in just the few days that John had been gone. Wendy listened to them with growing unease. "I feel like I've been hypnotized," Snog was saying. "I can't believe I was making life-changing promises to some 17-year-old. "If what John was telling us is true," Wendy began. "Hey, he lied about his age," Yam pointed out. "That's because you guys were making such a big deal about it," she said crossly. "Anyway, if Judgment Day happens, then at least we'll have lives." "His father is from the future," Brad said dreamily. "He probably hasn't even been born yet." He looked around at his friends. "How the hell does that work?" "Not too well," Yam commented. "At least as far as his dad was concerned." "Yeah," Carl agreed. "Imagine sending your father back through time to become your father, knowing he's going to get killed." There was silence as they all contemplated the idea. "I'd do it to my old man in a flash," Yam muttered. "Yeah, I've met him. I second that," Carl said. They high-fived. Wendy frowned but said nothing. She listened uneasily, not liking the implied criticism of John, and not sure where they were going with this. Not knowing for sure how she felt about all of this. On the one hand, she felt uneasy, knowing that all John's mother's ravings were nothing but the truth. On the other, she didn't like knowing that far from being the victim of some government conspiracy, his mother really had blown up a bunch of computer companies. And what would you have done? She kept asking herself. As yet, she didn't have an answer. "His mother must be terrifying," Brad said, almost as though he was listening in on her thoughts. "I heard she was a fox," Snog said, and waggled his brows. The guys started kidding and snickering about that, and Wendy listened. Maybe they were just acting out because John intimidated them. Her lips quirked in a smile. If 17-year-old John was intimidating, then maybe his mom actually was terrifying. "So what are we going to do?" Carl asked. He looked directly at Snog. Snog shrugged, his eyes wide in a manner that invited Carl to say more. "What do you mean, what are we going to do?" Wendy demanded. "Oh, come on," Carl almost shouted. "When he's around, you somehow can believe all that crazy shit. But let's get real, guys. A father who hasn't even been born yet? Killer robots. A maniacal computer that's going to blow up the world. That's bullshit. None of that can possibly be real." "But this is real," Snog said. He held up the chip that John had left with them. "And he sure didn't create this thing." He gave Wendy an apologetic glance. "John's smart, but he's not that smart, and he's not as smart as us. And none of us could have come up with this design. Never mind actually manufacturing it. I know we all want to go into denial, guys. I can feel the pull myself. But there's always this. He shook the chip. And this says it wasn't a dream and it isn't a lie. It's real. So what I'm gonna do is figure this baby out. Then I'm gonna get my degree and get the hell out of Dodge before the fire comes down. Wendy let out her pent-up breath quietly, tremendously relieved. If Snog had backed out on this project John had given them, the others would have followed his lead. There wouldn't have been a thing she could have done about it, either to change their minds or to retrieve the chip. She met Snog's glance, and she still didn't feel absolutely secure about him. But for now, he was on John's side, and that would have to do. Duffy's Diner, Utah. There had been a little spate of customers, and it was a half-hour later when the waitress noticed that the three men were still seated, unmoving and silent before their untouched coffee. And the little girl wasn't back from the restroom yet. These guys are seriously getting on my nerves, she thought. She brought over their check. $28.87, boys, she said with a false cheer. Hope you enjoyed it. She stood, smiling expectantly, determined not to be intimidated by their size and their silence, even though she was. The three Terminators looked at her, their faces expressionless, unblinking. Then one of them took a wallet out of Alyssa's bag and extracted 2 20s. The waitress, so tense she actually felt taller, began to count out change. Then, as one, they suddenly rose and walked out, paying her no more attention than if she'd been invisible. Well, hell, she murmured. Then she shook herself. She'd been wrong. They were good tippers. But she hoped she'd never meet their like again. Soon after her strange customers had gone, it occurred to the waitress that she might want to check the ladies' room. She didn't quite trust that strange little girl. Opening the door, she found the place in perfect order. Well, as perfect as a restroom ever got. As she went back down the corridor, she decided to check the men's room to see if it needed paper. A blood-curdling scream was heard all the way to the kitchen.